The night Marcus Holt sent the invitation, he was smiling. She knew this because she knew him. 13 years of marriage teaches you the shape of a man's cruelty, the particular tilt of his mouth when he thinks he has won something. And when the envelope arrived at her apartment on a gray Tuesday in February, thick cream paper, embossed gold lettering, hand-delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet her eyes. Helena Voss understood immediately that this was not an act of courtesy. It was a dare. Mr. Marcus Holt and Miss Tiffany Lau request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration. Saturday, the 22nd of March, the Meridian Grand, Ottawa. Helena set the card on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment, looking at it the way you'd look at something that might bite. Then she put the kettle on, because that's what you do when your ex-husband invites you to his wedding, 2 months after your divorce is finalized. And you need to think clearly, and you are 38 years old, and you have 2 children asleep down the hall, and you are not. You have decided going to cry about this anymore. She didn't know yet that attending would change everything. She only knew, standing in her galley kitchen in a rented apartment in Canada with the February wind pushing against the windows, that Marcus expected her to show up broken. That alone was reason enough to make sure she didn't. People who hadn't seen the collapse from the inside always said the same thing, but you two seemed so happy. And Helena used to nod and say something gracious, something that let them keep their image of her intact. What she didn't say, what she had no language for, in those first raw months, was that happiness and stability are not the same thing, and she had confused them for over a decade. She had met Marcus in her second year of residency. He was finishing his law degree, brilliant and restless and absolutely certain the world owed him a spectacular life. She was 25 and exhausted and impressed by his confidence, in a way she would later recognize as a warning sign. He made decisions quickly, and he made them for both of them, and at the time this had felt like strength. She'd been raised by a mother who second-guessed everything, who made every choice feel like a referendum on her own adequacy, and Marcus's certainty felt like oxygen. They married the year she finished residency. They bought a house in Barhaven. They had Owen and then, 4 years later, Lily. Helena worked part-time in the years after Owen was born, then returned to her cardiology practice full-time when both children were in school. She built something real, a patient list, a reputation, colleagues who trusted her. She came home tired and she made dinner anyway. And she remembered school events and doctor's appointments and the names of her children's friends. Marcus, meanwhile, had become a senior partner at a boutique firm downtown. His hours were brutal, but so were hers, and they had agreed early on that this was what their life would look like. What she hadn't agreed to, what she had not known she was agreeing to, was the slow redistribution of respect that happened in those years. The way her income, once she began earning more than him, became a source of tension he never named directly. The way her opinions in the marriage narrowed gradually until she mostly offered them in rooms he wasn't in. The way he began traveling to conferences more frequently starting about 3 years before the end, and came back from each one a little further away. Tiffany Lau was a junior associate at his firm. Helena found out the way women always find out. Not dramatically, not with a confrontation, but with an accumulation of small things that suddenly arranged themselves into a shape she could no longer unsee. A text message notification on a shared iPad, a name mentioned with a particular casualness, a receipt from a restaurant she'd never been to. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She sat down at the dining room table on a Wednesday evening while the children were doing homework, and she said, very quietly, "How long?" 3 years, he told her. She asked him to leave that night. He did. What came next was the part nobody asks about at dinner parties. The part that happened while the children were watching television, and she was on the phone with her lawyer, and her mother was calling from Sudbury, and the mortgage was in both their names, and she had to tell Owen, who was 12 and perceptive, and took the news with the careful blankness of a child who has already sensed something wrong for a long time, and Lily, who was 8 and cried for 40 minutes, and then asked if they could still have Christmas. Yes, Helena had told her. We will always have Christmas. The divorce took 14 months. Marcus's lawyer was aggressive, in a way that suggested Marcus had been preparing longer than she had. In the end, she kept the house for 2 years, while the children finished school terms, then sold it and split the proceeds. She got support for the children. Marcus had initially suggested an arrangement that would have had Helena carrying the majority of the household costs while he maintained his lifestyle, and her lawyer had dismantled this proposal methodically and without sentiment. What Helena carried out of the marriage, in addition to her children and her profession and herself, was the knowledge that she had been underestimating what she was worth for a very long time. The apartment in Canada was temporary. She was already looking at a house in the glebe, closer to the children's schools, with a garden and a room she could use as a home office. She was building again. She was 38 years old, and she was building again. And then the invitation arrived. She called her sister first. Bridget Voss, 2 years younger, and constitutionally incapable of indirectness, listened to the whole story without interrupting. Then she said, "He wants you to show up looking like you've been living on sadness and rent assistance." "That's what this is," Helena said she knew. "And are you going?" She hadn't decided yet. That was why she'd called. Bridget was quiet for a moment. "If you go and you walk in looking like yourself, actually like yourself, not like someone who's been treading water for a year, what does that do to his whole plan?" Helena looked at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. Her hair needed cutting. She was wearing an old university sweatshirt. She looked, she thought, like someone managing. "Go," Bridget said. But go right. There were people in her life who had appeared, quietly and without announcement, in the year after Marcus left. This is one of the things nobody prepares you for, that a marriage ending creates a kind of sorting, and some of the people you thought were fixtures turn out to have been his, or neutral, or simply unable to handle the weight of your altered life. But others step forward. Her colleague Dr. Amara Syed, who had brought food 3 times in the first month, and never once said, "I told you so." Her neighbors, the Nguyens, who watched the children on the nights Helena had to work late. Owen's hockey coach, who pulled her aside one evening in November and said quietly that Owen seemed to be carrying something heavy, and was there anything he should know, and did she need anything? And then there was Daniel Ashworth. She had known Daniel for 6 years, though not closely. He was a structural engineer who had done some work with her hospital's building committee. They'd met at a fundraiser and stayed loosely in touch, the way you do with people you find intelligent, and would talk to more if life weren't so full. After the separation, he had sent a text, brief, no pressure, just, "I heard. I'm sorry. If you ever want to grab coffee, no agenda, just say the word." She had taken him up on it in October, when she was drowning in paperwork and her apartment felt very small. They had coffee at a place on Bank Street and talked for 2.5 hours, and she had come home feeling for the first time in months like a full person rather than a set of logistics. By February, they were seeing each other regularly. She was careful with this, careful with herself, careful with her children, careful not to mistake comfort for something deeper. But Daniel was careful too, in his own way. He didn't rush her. He showed up when he said he would. He asked about Owen's hockey tournaments, and remembered Lily's preference for books over screens. He was not spectacular in the way Marcus had been spectacular. No particular performance of certainty, no grand gestures, just steady and attentive, and genuinely interested in who she was rather than who she was supposed to become. When the invitation arrived, she showed it to him over dinner the following week. He read it and said nothing for a moment. "What do you want to do?" She told him what Bridget had said. He nodded slowly. "I'd come with you," he said, "if you wanted. No pressure. But I'd be there." She looked at him across the table. He was not a billionaire. He was a structural engineer with a good reputation and an honest face and a truck that needed new brakes. But he was hers, in the particular way that matters. Chosen, not performed. "Yes," she said, "I think that's exactly what I want." The weeks before the wedding, she did not spend obsessing over Marcus's plan. She had a practice to run, children to raise, a life that required her full attention. What she did, deliberately and without drama, was the quiet work of becoming more fully herself. She got her hair cut, not shorter, just cleaned up, the way it had looked before the worst years when she'd stopped bothering. She found a dress at a boutique on Elgin Street, a deep burgundy wool crepe that her colleague Amara said made her look like someone who had made peace with herself, which Helena decided was the highest compliment she had ever received. She bought new heels, not uncomfortable heels, not heels designed to punish, heels that worked with her height rather than against it, She arranged for her mother to stay with Owen and Lily on the Saturday. She did not tell the children where she was going. They were too young to carry that. On the morning of March 22nd, she woke up before her alarm, lay still for a moment in the gray early light, and thought about all the ways this could go. Marcus would be expecting someone frayed, someone who flinched, someone who would stand at the edge of the room and confirm by her mere presence that she was still defined by what he had done to her. She got up, she showered, she put on the burgundy dress. Daniel picked her up at 6. He wore a dark charcoal suit she hadn't seen before. He held the door of his truck open for her. His truck, not a limousine, not a performance. And when she climbed in, he said simply, "You look like yourself." And she understood what he meant. Not beautiful, not transformed, not revenge-dressed. Herself. The version of herself she'd been working toward, quietly, for a year. "Thank you," she said. "Let's go." The Meridian Grand was one of those Ottawa venues that people booked to signal that no expense had been considered excessive. The lobby smelled of white lilies and heated stone. There were candles everywhere, the small, glowing kind that collectively produced the impression of effortlessness at significant cost. The reception space overlooked the river, dark and still in the March night. They arrived at 7:15. The cocktail hour was already underway. Helena had known some of these people for over a decade. Many of them had been at her wedding to Marcus. She had held their children and attended their parents' funerals and brought casseroles to their homes when they were ill. And she had watched, over the 14 months of the divorce, as a portion of them had quietly recalibrated, taken his calls more readily, stopped including her in group texts, treated her with the particular awkwardness of people who have chosen a side and are uncomfortable in the presence of the side they didn't choose. She was prepared for this. What she was not quite prepared for was how little it hurt, now that she was actually standing in the room. She walked in with her hand in Daniel's. That was all. No announcement, no entrance designed for effect, just two people arriving at a party. The shift in the room was subtle but unmistakable. She felt it the way you feel a current change underwater. Heads turned. Conversations stalled. Someone, she caught it from the corner of her eye, leaned to whisper to someone else. Marcus's sister, Corinna Holt, was the first person Helena saw clearly. Corinna had always liked Helena more than her brother deserved, and her expression now was something complicated, guilt and relief mixed together. She crossed the room immediately. "Helena." She gripped both her hands. "You look wonderful." A pause, quiet, and waited. "You really do." "Thank you," Helena said. "You remember Daniel." Corinna shook Daniel's hand with the warmth of someone grateful to have something to do with her hands. Of course, yes." She lowered her voice slightly. "I want you to know I tried to talk him out of. I didn't think this was." She stopped. "I'm glad you came." "So am I," Helena said. And she meant it. Marcus found her 40 minutes into the evening. She had been half expecting it. The way you expect a weather system that's been building on the horizon. She and Daniel were in conversation with two of her former hospital colleagues, laughing about something that had nothing to do with Marcus or weddings or the elaborate theater of tonight, and she felt the shift in the room's attention before she saw him. He looked good. He had always looked good. This was one of the more unfair things about Marcus, that he wore confidence like a well-cut suit, and the years had only settled it more firmly on him. He was coming toward her with the particular expression he used in professional contexts. Controlled, pleasant, the face of a man who has prepared what he's going to say. What he hadn't prepared for, she could see clearly, was this. He'd expected, what? A woman braced for impact. Someone who'd come to prove something, visibly, strenuously. Someone he could survey from across the room and feel confirmed in what he believed about her. Instead, there was Helena. Talking, laughing, standing easily beside a man who was watching her with the uncomplicated attention of someone who had nowhere else he'd rather be. "Helena," Marcus said. His voice was even. "I'm glad you could make it." She looked at him for a moment, this man she had known for 15 years, who had been her life and then had chosen not to be, and she felt something she had not expected, almost nothing, not anger, not grief, a kind of clear, still recognition, like looking at a photograph of a place you used to live. "Marcus." She smiled, because she was a person who smiled, and she had nothing to perform here, nothing to suppress. "Congratulations. The venue is beautiful." A brief, precise silence. "This is Daniel Ashworth," she said. "He's working on the new cardiac wing at the General." The two men shook hands. Marcus's expression did not change, exactly. But something shifted behind it. The particular recalibration of a person whose calculation has come up wrong. "I hope you enjoy the evening," Helena said, and turned back to her colleagues. And that was all. She heard about the rest of it later, pieced it together from Corinna and from Amara, who had been seated 2 tables away and missed nothing. What Marcus had planned for the evening was never entirely clear. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be named and condemned. Just inviting her. Letting the room see her, letting the contrast speak. Tiffany at the head table, radiant and chosen. Helena somewhere in the middle distance, presumably smaller than she'd once been. What happened instead was that Helena moved through the evening the way she moved through difficult rounds. With focus and without self-consciousness, doing the work of being present. She danced with Daniel during the first open song. She had a long conversation with Marcus's oldest friend, a man named Garrett who had served as a groomsman and who spent 20 minutes telling her that he'd always admired how she'd handled everything, that she was clearly doing well, that his own wife had gone through something similar 8 years ago and had come out stronger on the other side. He said it without agenda, just as fact. "We saw it coming," he told her quietly, so that no one else could hear. "Most of us did. I want you to know that." She thanked him. She meant it. Marcus and Tiffany circulated through the room with the efficiency of people completing a checklist. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, Helena overheard a fragment of conversation from a cluster of guests she didn't know. The bride's side, she thought. Something about paperwork, something about accounts, something that made 2 of the 3 people in the group go very still. She didn't pursue it. It wasn't hers to pursue. What she found out 2 weeks later from her lawyer in an entirely separate context was that a complaint had been filed with the Law Society of Ontario regarding certain billing practices at Marcus's firm. The details were not her business, and she made no effort to learn them. But the conversation at the wedding had been about this. Tiffany's family had connections in the financial sector, and certain things had come to their attention recently, and questions had begun to be asked that Marcus would need to answer. Helena learned this information, and she sat with it for a moment. And then she made herself a cup of tea and thought about her children, and the house she was close to buying in the Glebe, and the patient she'd seen that morning, a retired schoolteacher from Nepean, who had been scared and was doing better now. She thought about all the things that were hers, that had always been hers, that no one had given her and no one could take. She thought about how she had walked into that room and felt nothing she needed to manage. That felt like the real thing. That felt like what she'd been building toward. She told Owen and Lily about Daniel in April, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow had finally started to mean it, and the yard smelled like approaching mud, and everything felt tentatively, provisionally like spring. Owen shrugged in the way of 13-year-olds who are processing more than they show, and said, "He seems decent." This, Helena knew, was high praise. Lily climbed into Daniel's lap approximately 40 minutes into the visit and demanded to know if he could play Uno. He could. He lost 3 games in a row, which Lily found deeply satisfying, and which Helena suspected was not entirely accidental. That evening, after Daniel had gone and the children were in bed, Helena stood in her kitchen in the Canada apartment, the one she would be leaving in 6 weeks, the one that had been transitional and sufficient, and looked around at the evidence of her life. Lily's spelling homework on the counter, Owen's hockey gloves drying on the radiator, a stack of cardiology journals she kept meaning to finish. A card Bridget had sent her months ago, still on the fridge, that just said, "Still here, still rooting for you." She thought about the wedding, which felt already like something from a different chapter. She had gone because a man thought it would break her to attend. She had left having confirmed only that it wouldn't, and somewhere between those 2 things. In 40 years of life built by her own hands, in children who were difficult and beloved, in a practice that mattered, and a man who chose her quietly and consistently, in a sister who was always on the other end of the phone, she had understood something she might have known earlier if she hadn't spent so long measuring herself against someone else's idea of her value. She was not what Marcus had thought she was when he looked across that room. She was not his narrative at all. She washed the dinner dishes. She checked that the children were sleeping. She looked at the house listing in the glebe one more time on her phone. The garden, the extra room, the street with the old maple trees, and she allowed herself to feel what it actually was. Not a consolation, not a rebuilding from the rubble. A beginning. The kind that doesn't announce itself as a beginning, that just starts quietly on a Tuesday in a kitchen, while the kettle boils and the children sleep, and somewhere outside the snow is finally letting go. She sent an offer on the house the following morning. They accepted by noon.